Historians claim this journal was a fake, but none of them could explain the symbols written inside. This could be the final words of a Templar knight who escaped capture, and perhaps it reveals why the Vatican has been trying to erase these pages for centuries. In 1894, a peasant farmer clearing rubble from an abandoned monastery in southern France found something sealed between two foundation stones, a leather-bound journal bearing a Templar cross and filled with writing that shouldn't exist. The first page declared, "I am Brother Hugues de Montbard, last guardian of the forbidden knowledge." Within days of its discovery, mysterious men from Rome arrived, demanding its surrender. The village priest who had copied several pages died in a suspicious fire 2 weeks later. The original journal vanished into Vatican archives, never to be seen again. But those copied pages revealed something extraordinary, a first-hand account of what the Templars really found beneath Jerusalem, why the church destroyed them, and where they hid their greatest secrets before the end. This is the story that someone desperately wanted buried forever.
The name signed at the beginning of the journal, Brother Hugues of Montbard, immediately caught the attention of Templar historians. This wasn't a random name. Hugues de Montbard was documented as a real historical figure, though official records about him were frustratingly sparse and contradictory. What little survived in church archives indicated he was a high-ranking Templar knight who served in Jerusalem during the Order's height of power, and then simply disappeared from all records around 1307, the year of the Great Persecution. But here's what made the journal's authorship compelling. The historical Hugues of Montbard was the nephew of Bernard of Clairvaux, the powerful church figure who had championed the Templars' official recognition at the Council of Troyes in 1128. This family connection would have given Hugues access to the inner circles of both the church hierarchy and the Templar command structure. He would have known secrets that ordinary knights never learned. He would have understood exactly why his order was targeted for destruction. And most importantly, if he chose to break his vows of silence, he could reveal truths that would shake the foundations of medieval Christianity. The journal's opening pages establish who Hugues was and why he's writing. He describes himself as one of the 13, a reference that sent chills through scholars familiar with Templar legends. For centuries, rumors had persisted that within the public order of Knights Templar there existed a secret inner council of 13 members who held the true knowledge recovered from beneath Solomon's temple. These 13 allegedly conducted rituals that differed dramatically from standard Christian practice, possessed artifacts of tremendous power, and understood secrets about the origins of humanity that the Church had spent centuries suppressing. Official history recognized only 12 top Templar leaders, the Grand Master and his closest advisors, but legends always spoke of a 13th member, someone who existed outside official records, whose very existence was denied. If Hugues was claiming membership in this hidden council, he was positioning himself as a guardian of the Order's deepest mysteries, exactly the kind of person whose testimony would be considered catastrophically dangerous by church authorities. The journal's early entries detail Hugues' recruitment into the Templars and his gradual initiation into deeper levels of the Order's secrets. He writes of arriving in Jerusalem as a young knight, expecting to serve as a defender of Christian pilgrims. Instead, he was selected for special duty based on what he calls his bloodline markers, a phrase that appears repeatedly throughout the journal and seems to refer to genetic or hereditary traits that the Templars were actively seeking in their recruits. This concept of bloodline selection immediately raises questions. The official Templar recruitment emphasized martial skill, noble birth, and Christian devotion. But Hugues describes a parallel selection process hidden within the public one, where certain individuals were identified through subtle signs, physical characteristics, unusual abilities, even what he describes as resonance with sacred sites and ancient artifacts. These specially selected individuals were gradually brought into the inner mysteries, taught practices and knowledge that contradicted everything the Church taught about history, religion, and human nature. Hughes writes extensively about his first year in Jerusalem, during which he served in public roles, guarding pilgrims, training recruits, maintaining Templar properties, while simultaneously undergoing a secret education. He describes being taken into underground chambers beneath the Temple Mount, shown artifacts recovered during the early excavations, and gradually exposed to texts written in languages he didn't recognize. His teachers, senior members of the Inner Circle, claimed these texts predated not just Christianity and Judaism, but recorded human civilization itself. The journal contains detailed descriptions of these teaching sessions. Hughes recalls being shown star charts that mapped constellations with accuracy that wouldn't be achieved by European astronomy for another 5 centuries. He examined architectural plans for structures that incorporated mathematical principles unknown to medieval scholars. Most disturbing to his Christian worldview, he read theological texts that presented Jesus not as the unique Son of God, but as one of many enlightened teachers across history who had accessed an ancient system of spiritual knowledge that the early Church had spent centuries suppressing. His initial reaction, he admits, was horror and denial. Everything he had been taught since childhood about God, salvation, the Church's divine authority seemed to crumble under the weight of evidence presented in those underground chambers. He seriously considered fleeing the order, perhaps even reporting what he'd learned to Church authorities.
But his teachers had anticipated this crisis of faith. They explained that the choice before him was not between truth and lies, but between different layers of truth, the simplified version taught to the masses and the deeper reality preserved by those initiated into the mysteries. What kept Hughes from leaving was the evidence itself. These weren't just theoretical arguments or philosophical debates. He was holding physical artifacts in his hands, objects whose construction required technologies that shouldn't exist in the medieval world. He was reading documents whose age could be verified through the material itself, documents that described historical events predating any known civilization. Most compelling of all, he was learning practices, what he calls techniques of consciousness, that produced measurable results, allowing him to access information and abilities that transcended normal human limitations. The journal describes Hugues's transformation from doubting initiate to committed guardian. Over several years, he progressed through what appears to be a structured system of advancement, each level revealing more of the hidden knowledge, while also binding him more tightly to the inner circle through oaths and rituals. By the time he was accepted into the Council of 13, he had become something very different from the naive young knight who had arrived in Jerusalem. He had accessed what he calls genetic memories, inherited knowledge carried in his bloodline that could be awakened through specific practices. He could recognize other carriers of the ancient bloodline by subtle signs imperceptible to ordinary people, and he had accepted a mission that transcended his personal life, to preserve knowledge that could either elevate humanity or, if misused, enslave it. But the journal also reveals the price of this knowledge. Hughes describes growing alienation from his fellow knights who weren't part of the inner circle. He could no longer participate genuinely in standard Christian services, knowing what he knew about the religion's constructed nature. He lived in constant awareness that he possessed secrets that powerful forces would kill to suppress. The weight of this burden appears throughout his writing, a man carrying knowledge that isolates him from normal human connection while binding him to an ancient responsibility that stretches back millennia. His relationship with his uncle, Bernard of Clairvaux, becomes particularly complex in light of this hidden knowledge. Bernard had been the public champion of the Templars, writing eloquently about their holy mission, but Hughes hints that Bernard knew more than his public writings suggested. that his support for the Templars wasn't just about defending pilgrims, but about protecting an organization that preserved knowledge the Church itself had forgotten or deliberately suppressed. The journal contains cryptic references to conversations in shadows, where Bernard and senior Templars discussed matters that could never be committed to official records. The first section of the journal concludes with Hugues's elevation to full membership in the Council of 13. He describes a ceremony held in the deepest chamber beneath the Temple Mount, in a space he claims predates Solomon's original temple by thousands of years. 13 figures in white robes, each representing a different aspect of the preserved knowledge, each carrying a portion of the ancient bloodline, swearing oaths not to God or Church, but to humanity itself, to preserve and protect truths that could transform human civilization if released at the right moment, or destroy it if released prematurely. This ceremony marks a turning point in the journal's tone. Everything before this describes Hugues's journey towards understanding. Everything after describes his mission to preserve that understanding in the face of forces determined to eliminate it. Because by the time he's writing these words, the persecution has already begun. The enemies he describes aren't just the French king or corrupt church officials. They're representatives of an opposing faction, descendants of the same ancient bloodline, but with radically different beliefs about how that heritage should be used. These controllers, as Hugues calls them, have infiltrated the highest levels of both church and secular authority, and they've decided that the Templars' guardianship of the ancient knowledge represents an intolerable threat to their own agenda. The stage is set for the conflict that will destroy the visible Templar Order, while, if Hugues' plans succeed, ensuring that the hidden knowledge survives into future generations. But first, he must explain exactly what that knowledge is, what the Templars found beneath Jerusalem that was valuable enough to die for, dangerous enough to kill for, and profound enough to change everything humanity believes about its own origins and destiny.
The second section of Hugues de Montbard's journal shifts from biographical narrative to detailed documentation of practices that the Church would later use to justify the Templars' destruction. But reading his descriptions carefully, what emerges isn't devil worship or heresy. It's something far more challenging to Orthodox Christianity, a systematic methodology for accessing altered states of consciousness and awakening dormant human capabilities through techniques preserved from ancient civilizations. Hugues begins this section with a warning written in larger script than the surrounding text. What follows will seem blasphemous to those trained in church doctrine, but blasphemy is simply truth that threatens established power. I record these practices not to corrupt, but to preserve. Future generations may be ready to understand what our age cannot accept. The first ritual he described took place shortly after his acceptance into the Council of 13. He calls it the Ceremony of Awakening, a multi-day process conducted in the underground chambers beneath the Temple Mount, designed to activate what he terms dormant genetic sequences carried by those of the ancient bloodline. The ceremony required specific preparation. 3 days of fasting, consuming only water mixed with herbs he doesn't name, possibly for legal protection, possibly because the formula was too sacred to commit fully to writing, and spending hours in absolute darkness to reset the sensory apparatus. The ceremony itself involved elements that would have horrified medieval Christians. Participants removed their clothing and ritual white robes, standing naked in a circle around a central altar. This nakedness, Hugues explains, wasn't about sexuality or degradation. It was about removing all markers of social status, religious affiliation, and cultural conditioning. In that underground chamber, they weren't Christian knights or European nobles. They were humans accessing capabilities that predated civilization itself. On the altar lay what Hugues describes as the luminous codex, almost certainly the same Codex Sanguinis mentioned in Templar legends.
He writes that it appeared to be made of metal sheets bound together, but the metal seemed to pulse with its own inner light, creating illumination that made torches unnecessary. Each participant in turn approached the codex, placed their hands on specific symbols inscribed on its surface, and experienced what Ug calls the download. His description of this experience is vivid and unsettling. The moment his hands touched the codex's surface, he felt electrical energy surge through his body, not painful, but overwhelmingly intense. His vision flooded with images, cities of impossible architecture, technologies that manipulated gravity and light, astronomical observations from perspectives that suggested viewing from space, and most disturbingly, memories that weren't his own. He experienced lifetimes lived by his ancestors, not just the recent medieval generations, but consciousness stretching back thousands of years to civilizations that existed before any recorded history. The experience lasted what felt like hours, but was actually only minutes. When he withdrew his hands from the codex, he was weeping uncontrollably, overwhelmed by the sudden expansion of his consciousness. The senior members of the council allowed him time to integrate what he'd received, offering no interpretation or explanation. The awakening had to be direct and personal, not filtered through someone else's understanding. But the ceremony didn't end with the codex contact. What followed was described in passages that Vatican censors worked hardest to suppress. The 13 participants engaged in what Ug calls energy circulation practices, physical movements, breath patterns, and vocal toning that he claims were designed to stabilize and integrate the genetic activation triggered by the codex. Some of these practices involved physical contact between participants, hands placed on specific points on each other's bodies, coordinated breathing while maintaining eye contact, even what sounds like therapeutic body work to release tensions created by the consciousness expansion. Medieval inquisitors reading descriptions of naked knights touching each other in underground chambers saw only evidence of sodomy and obscene practices, but Ug's account makes clear these weren't sexual acts. They were sophisticated techniques for managing human bioenergetic systems, practices preserved from ancient civilizations that understood human consciousness far better than medieval Europe did. The physical contact served specific purposes, grounding overwhelming energies, creating resonance between individuals to strengthen the collective awakening, and teaching through direct transmission rather than verbal instruction. The most controversial element of the ceremony involved what accusers later called denying Christ and spitting on the cross. Ug's journal provides context that transforms this charge from heresy to something more nuanced. At a certain point in the ceremony, each initiate was presented with a crucifix and asked to perform a symbolic rejection. But this wasn't about denying Jesus' teachings or importance. It was about transcending the limited understanding of divinity that institutional Christianity represented. Ug writes, "We were taught that the cross has become a symbol of limitation, of suffering as the path to salvation, of humanity as fallen and needing rescue, of divine truth as the exclusive property of one institution. To progress beyond this limitation, we had to symbolically reject not Christ himself, but the cage that church doctrine had built around his actual message. The spitting was not contempt, but release, releasing ourselves from mental chains that prevented accessing the deeper truths Jesus himself had taught to his inner circle." This distinction would have meant nothing to inquisitors, of course. The act itself, spitting on the cross, was sufficient to prove heresy regardless of internal motivation. But for Ug and his fellow initiates, it was a necessary psychological breakthrough, a demonstration that they had moved beyond the need for external religious authority and could access spiritual truth directly. The ceremony concluded with what Ug calls the Oath of Preservation. Each member of the council swore not to God or church, but to the knowledge itself, to preserve it, protect it, and transmit it to future generations, even at the cost of their own lives. The oath was taken in complete darkness, the only illumination coming from the Codex's inner light.
And the words weren't in Latin or any language Hughes initially recognized, though he found he could speak them fluently, a language that his newly awakened genetic memories provided access to, a tongue that predated the division at Bamble, a means of communication that carried meaning at levels deeper than ordinary speech. Beyond this primary awakening ceremony, the journal describes other regular practices that the inner circle maintained. Daily meditation sessions in specific chambers chosen for their resonance properties, locations where the stone structure itself seemed to amplify consciousness-altering effects. Hughes notes that these chambers were positioned at precise points beneath the Temple Mount, aligned with astronomical features and what he calls terrestrial energy currents. Modern readers might recognize this as describing ley lines or geomantic principles, though Hughes' explanation suggests a more sophisticated understanding than simple mystical speculation. The Templars also practiced what Hughes terms genetic memory retrieval sessions. Small groups would gather in particular chambers, consume specific herbal preparations, and enter deep meditative states designed to access inherited knowledge. He describes experiencing vivid, detailed visions of ancient civilizations, walking through cities built on principles of sacred geometry, observing technologies that seemed like magic to medieval understanding, accessing scientific knowledge about astronomy, medicine, and consciousness that wouldn't be discovered by mainstream civilization for centuries. But not all the rituals were introspective or mystical. The journal documents practical applications of the awakened abilities. Hughes describes training sessions where council members practiced what he calls enhanced perception, reading another person's intentions through subtle body language invisible to normal observation, sensing the presence of others who carried the bloodline markers, even detecting when they were under surveillance by the opposing faction. These weren't supernatural powers in the fantasy sense, but heightened human capabilities that genetic activation made accessible. Abilities that gave the Templars significant advantages in intelligence gathering, negotiation, and identifying potential recruits or enemies. One particularly controversial practice involved what accusers called worshipping a head. Hughes' journal reveals this referred to a ritual involving a carved sculpture that the Templars called Baphomet, though he's careful to note this wasn't a deity being worshipped. The head was a three-dimensional representation of sacred geometry. Its proportions encoded mathematical relationships that, when meditated upon, triggered specific states of consciousness. The sculpture showed a face that was simultaneously male and female, young and old, human and animal, representing the unity of apparent opposites, the transcendence of dualistic thinking that prevented accessing deeper truths. Gazing at Baphomet during meditation sessions, Hughes writes, induced experiences of consciousness expansion, temporary states where the boundaries of individual identity dissolved, where he felt connected to the vast network of awakened individuals across time and space. This wasn't worship in any conventional sense. It was a technology of consciousness, a tool for accessing non-ordinary states that provided access to information unavailable through normal perception. The rituals also included practices that specifically prepared the Templars for the persecution they knew was coming. Hughes describes dissolution training, exercises designed to help them maintain secrecy under interrogation, to fragment their consciousness in ways that would allow parts of their knowledge to survive even if they personally were captured and killed.
This training explains why during the actual persecution, Templar confessions were so contradictory and confusing. Different knights revealed different pieces of a larger puzzle, but no single captured Templar possessed or revealed the complete picture. Perhaps most disturbing to church authorities would have been the journal's descriptions of healing practices. Hughes documents cases where council members used techniques learned from the ancient knowledge to cure diseases, heal injuries, and even extend lifespans beyond normal medieval parameters. These weren't miracles in the Christian sense, divine interventions proving God's favor. They were applications of preserved medical knowledge from civilizations that understood human biology at levels medieval medicine couldn't approach. One passage describes treating a knight who had suffered a severe head injury that should have left him permanently impaired. Using a combination of herbal medicines, specific touch therapies applied to points on his skull and spine, and guided meditation practices, the healers restored his function almost completely. Hughes notes that these techniques were based on understanding of what he calls life force channels running through the human body, a concept that wouldn't enter Western medicine until much later, though Eastern traditions had preserved similar knowledge. The second section of the journal concludes with Hughes' acknowledgement that these practices, if revealed publicly, would seem like devil worship to those trained in Orthodox Christianity. "We do not commune with demons," he writes. "We access capabilities that lie dormant in every human waiting to be awakened." The Church calls this heresy because it threatens their monopoly on spiritual authority. If people knew they could access divine wisdom directly, without priestly mediation, what need would they have for the institution that claims to stand between humanity and God? This final statement captures why the journal was so dangerous and why Vatican authorities worked so desperately to suppress it. Hughes wasn't describing alternatives to Christianity, he was describing practices that made institutional religion obsolete. He was documenting a systematic methodology for human transformation that, if widely adopted, would render the entire structure of medieval Christendom unnecessary. The Church's power rested on its claim to exclusive access to salvation. The Templars' hidden knowledge suggested salvation wasn't something granted by external authority, but an internal transformation available to anyone with the proper techniques and guidance. And that was the unforgivable heresy of all, not worshiping devils or denying God, but suggesting that the Church itself was unnecessary for humanity's spiritual evolution.
The third section of Hugues de Montbard's journal finally addresses the question that has obsessed treasure hunters and historians for 7 centuries. What exactly did the Templars find beneath Solomon's temple? His answer is both more profound and more disturbing than legends of gold or the Ark of the Covenant suggest. Hugues begins with a philosophical distinction. Men search for treasure believing it means gold, jewels, objects of material value. But the greatest treasures are those that transform consciousness itself. What we found beneath Jerusalem was not wealth to be spent, but knowledge that could remake humanity if we proved worthy of it, or destroy us if we were not. He describes the early days of Templar excavation beneath the Temple Mount, work that officially began in 1119, but which Hugues claims was actually the culmination of investigations that started much earlier. The 9 founding knights, he writes, didn't choose Jerusalem randomly or out of simple piety. They were following information contained in documents that had been preserved through centuries, texts that described exactly what lay buried beneath the ruins, where to dig, and what they would find. The excavation took years of dangerous, exhausting work. The chambers they sought weren't directly beneath the visible ruins of the Second Temple, destroyed by Rome in 70 AD. They were far deeper, carved into bedrock, dating to a period that predated even Solomon's construction of the First Temple in the 10th century BC. These chambers, according to the ancient texts guiding the Templars, had been created by an even older civilization. the same advanced culture whose hybrid descendants carried the genetic markers the Templars were seeking in their recruits. Hug provides detailed descriptions of the discovery process. Breaking through a sealed wall after 3 years of excavation, the Knights found themselves in a vast chamber whose smooth walls showed precision cutting that shouldn't have been possible with Bronze Age tools. The air inside, sealed for thousands of years, had a strange quality. It seemed to shimmer and vibrate, making the torchlight dance in patterns that hurt the eyes if watched too long. The chamber was empty of furniture or decoration, but the walls themselves were covered, floor to ceiling, with inscriptions in multiple languages and scripts, some recognizable, ancient Hebrew, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Phoenician, others completely unknown. But the chamber's walls were merely the introduction. At its far end, concealed behind a stone door sealed with lead and bronze, they found what Hug calls the Chamber of Light. A smaller space, perfectly cubic in dimensions, its walls made of a substance that appeared to be polished black stone, but which gave off a faint luminescence even in complete darkness. In the center of this chamber, resting on a pedestal of the same black material, was the object that would transform the Templars from simple knights to guardians of humanity's hidden heritage, the Codex Sanguinis, the Book of Blood. Hug's description of the Codex matches other legendary accounts but adds details that suggest he actually handled it personally. The book consisted of thin metal sheets, he estimates perhaps 50 pages, bound together through some means he couldn't determine as there were no visible hinges, thread, or fasteners. The metal appeared to be silver or platinum, but it was warm to the touch rather than cold and seemed to generate its own soft golden light. This wasn't reflected light or phosphorescence. The metal itself was luminous, brightening slightly when touched by human hands, as if responding to contact. The Codex's pages were covered with text and diagrams in multiple scripts, but here's where the account becomes truly extraordinary. Hug claims that the writing seemed to shift depending on who was reading it. When he first examined it, the script appeared to be a mixture of Latin and Greek with symbols he didn't recognize. But as he continued reading, the unfamiliar symbols somehow became legible, not because he learned to decode them, but because his mind was being taught to read them directly. The Codex wasn't just transmitting information through conventional writing, it was interfacing with the reader's consciousness, adapting its presentation to match the individual's ability to comprehend. The content of the Codex, as Hug understood it, contained several categories of information. First, there were historical records describing the rise and fall of the ancient hybrid civilization, the culture that had created the genetic modifications allowing certain humans to access enhanced consciousness. These records documented technologies, social structures, and capabilities that seemed like science fiction to medieval understanding. Manipulation of gravity for construction purposes, understanding of atomic and subatomic reality, mastery of electromagnetic forces, and most remarkably, the ability to imprint information directly into genetic material, creating inherited memories that could be passed to descendants. Hug provides detailed descriptions of the discovery process. Breaking through a sealed wall after 3 years of excavation, the Knights found themselves in a vast chamber whose smooth walls showed precision cutting that shouldn't have been possible with Bronze Age tools. The air inside, sealed for thousands of years, had a strange quality. It seemed to shimmer and vibrate, making the torchlight dance in patterns that hurt the eyes if watched too long. The chamber was empty of furniture or decoration, but the walls themselves were covered floor to ceiling with inscriptions in multiple languages and scripts, some recognizable, ancient Hebrew, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Phoenician, others completely unknown.
But the Codex wasn't just a book of knowledge. Hughes describes it as having additional properties that bordered on the miraculous. When held during meditation, it seemed to amplify consciousness-altering effects, making it easier to access genetic memories and enhanced states of awareness. Groups of people touching it simultaneously reported shared experiences, momentary telepathic connections where they could perceive each other's thoughts and memories directly. And most remarkably, it appeared to be indestructible. Hughes witnessed attempts to test its durability, strikes with hammers, exposure to fire that left no mark whatsoever on its surface. Beyond the codex itself, the Chamber of Light contained other artifacts. Hughes described several objects whose purpose he could only guess at, crystalline structures that seemed to store and project light in complex patterns, metal instruments with no obvious function but which resonated when touched in specific ways, and small containers holding substances, possibly genetic samples or medicinal preparations, that remained perfectly preserved despite millennia of storage. But perhaps the most significant discovery wasn't a physical object at all. On the walls of the deepest chamber, beneath layers of text and diagram, Hughes and his fellow knights found what he calls the Map of Knowledge, a vast chart showing the locations of other hidden repositories across the known world and beyond. This map indicated that the Chamber of Light beneath Jerusalem wasn't unique. Similar caches existed in locations scattered from Ireland to India, from North Africa to lands beyond the Mediterranean that European maps of the time didn't even acknowledge existed. Each marked location on the map corresponded to a site of ancient power, places that later civilizations had recognized as sacred without understanding why. The map suggested that the ancient hybrid civilization had created a global network of knowledge repositories, deliberately distributed to ensure preservation, even if some sites were discovered or destroyed. The Templars realized they hadn't found the treasure, they had found a map to dozens of treasures, each potentially containing different aspects of the preserved knowledge. This discovery transformed the Templar mission. They were no longer simply guardians of one cache of ancient knowledge beneath Jerusalem. They were coordinators of a global recovery operation, working to locate and secure the other repositories before the opposing faction, the controllers who had infiltrated church and royal courts, could find and destroy them. The rapid expansion of Templar commanderies across Europe and the Mediterranean wasn't random or purely economic. Each new establishment was positioned to investigate or protect sites indicated on the ancient map. Hughes describes several expeditions he personally participated in, traveling to remote locations to investigate sites marked on the map. In caves beneath the Pyrenees, they found astronomical instruments of impossible precision. In ruins along the coast of Scotland, they discovered architectural fragments showing construction techniques that shouldn't have existed in Neolithic times. In monasteries in Ireland, they identified texts that had been preserved by monks who didn't understand what they were copying, fragments of the ancient knowledge that had survived, camouflaged as religious manuscripts. But with each discovery came increased danger. The more they found, the more obvious their activities became to those watching. The controller faction, working through their agents in church and royal courts, began taking note of Templar travels, of their interest in seemingly insignificant archaeological sites, of their collection of ancient manuscripts that had nothing to do with Christian devotion. The Templars were accumulating too much knowledge too quickly. They were becoming too powerful, too independent, too dangerous to the established order. Hughes includes a chilling observation about the nature of the treasure they had found. Quote, "Gold can be spent, jewels can be sold, but knowledge, true knowledge about human origins, potential, and destiny, that is the one treasure that threatens all earthly power. Kings rule because common people believe authority flows from God through royal bloodlines. The church rules because people believe salvation comes only through its sacraments, but what we found beneath Jerusalem proves that divine authority isn't inherited or bestowed. It's a capability encoded in human genetics, dormant in most, but accessible to those who know how to awaken it. This knowledge doesn't just threaten the church or kings, it threatens every hierarchical structure built on the assumption that most humans need to be ruled by a superior few. This realization that their discoveries fundamentally challenged all forms of institutional authority explained why the persecution would eventually come. It wasn't about gold or political rivalry or even religious heresy in the conventional sense. It was about knowledge that, if widely disseminated, would make existing power structures obsolete. The Templars had found evidence that humanity's potential exceeded what any church or kingdom wanted people to know, and that made them the most dangerous organization in the medieval world. The third section of the journal concludes with Hughes's account of the decision to evacuate and hide the treasures before the inevitable persecution. The Council of 13, reading the signs of approaching danger, initiated a complex operation to distribute the knowledge and artifacts across multiple hidden sites. The codex itself, too valuable and too dangerous to risk, would be moved from Jerusalem to a location Hughes describes only cryptically as the Sacred Mountain beyond the Northern Sea, possibly a reference to Scotland or Scandinavia, though he deliberately leaves the description vague to protect the location. Other artifacts and texts would be divided among the 13 council members, each taking their portion to different regions of Europe where they would establish hidden repositories, some in Templar commanderies, others in locations that had no obvious connection to the order. The strategy was redundancy. No single repository contained all the knowledge, so even if some were discovered and destroyed, the essential information would survive in other locations. "We are scattering seeds," Hughes writes, "knowing that some will be lost, some will remain dormant for centuries, but some, enough, will survive to flower when humanity is finally ready to receive what we have preserved. The light we found beneath Jerusalem isn't meant for our age. It's meant for a future when human consciousness has evolved enough to use this knowledge wisely rather than destroying itself with it. Until then, we guard it in darkness, waiting for the dawn."
The fourth section of Hugues de Montbard's journal transitions from philosophical and historical narrative to something far more practical and dangerous. Detailed instructions, encoded maps, and symbolic keys designed to allow future generations to locate the hidden repositories where Templar knowledge had been concealed. This section is where the journal shifts from testimony to treasure map, and where its suppression became most urgent for those who wanted Templar secrets to remain buried forever. Hughes begins this section with a technical explanation of the encoding system the Council of 13 developed. They couldn't simply write, "The treasure is buried at coordinates X, Y," because such obvious directions would be immediately understood and exploited by anyone who found the journal. Instead, they created a multi-layered system of codes and symbols that required specific knowledge to interpret, knowledge that would be accessible only to those who had undergone the awakening process or who carried sufficient genetic markers to recognize the patterns instinctively. The first layer of encoding involved what Hughes calls the language of geometry. Throughout the journal's margins and interspersed with the text are geometric diagrams that appear decorative but actually contain precise information. He explains that these aren't random designs, but representations of sacred geometry principles, ratios and proportions that encode numerical data. By measuring the relationships between different elements of these diagrams, someone with mathematical knowledge could extract coordinates, distances, and directional information. For example, Hughes includes a complex diagram showing interlocking circles, triangles, and spirals. To the casual observer, It appears to be mere medieval decoration, perhaps symbolizing Christian Trinity or other conventional religious imagery. But his accompanying text provides the key. The ratio between the outer circle's radius and the innermost triangle's height multiplied by the number of spiral turns yields the distance in Roman miles from the great cathedral. The angle at which the triangle's apex points gives the direction. Those who can see with awakened eyes will recognize which cathedral is meant, for it stands at the crossing of the ancient lines of power. This reference to a cathedral at the crossing of ancient lines of power exemplifies another encoding technique, using landmarks that initiates would recognize but outsiders would find ambiguous. Throughout the journal, Hughes refers to specific locations using descriptive phrases rather than names. The monastery, where stone remembers older stone. The fortress that guards the passage between waters. The chapel built upon the dreaming earth. Each phrase contains clues that someone with knowledge of Templar sites and sacred geography could decode, while remaining meaningless to uninformed readers. The journal contains several pages of what appear to be architectural drawings, floor plans of churches, elevations of fortifications, layouts of monastic complexes. But Hughes reveals these aren't simply records of existing buildings. They're maps disguised as architecture. By overlaying these building plans and measuring specific proportional relationships between architectural elements, a pattern emerges, a larger map showing routes across Europe with certain structures marking waypoints on a journey to hidden repositories. He provides explicit instructions for this overlay technique. Take the plan of the chapel with 7 pillars and the fortress with 3 towers. Align their central axes at the angle of the summer sun's rising. Where the chapel's eastern wall intersects with the fortress's southern gate, there lies the first marker. Follow such intersections across the 5 plans provided, and the path will reveal itself to those who have sight has been cleared. This overlay method explains why certain Templar structures were built with seemingly impractical or unnecessarily elaborate designs. They weren't just fortresses or churches, they were 3-dimensional markers in a coded navigation system. Someone with the journal's decoding instructions could use the architecture itself as a map, reading the landscape through the geometric relationships between specially designed buildings. The journal also contains extensive symbolic encryption using what Hughes calls the universal language, a system of symbols that appears throughout ancient cultures but which the Templars claimed to understand at a deeper level than conventional historians. He includes pages showing various symbols, spirals, crosses with specific proportions, star patterns, animal figures, each accompanied by layers of meaning. For instance, Hughes draws a symbol showing a serpent coiled around a sword. The obvious interpretation might be victory over evil or temptation, but he explains the serpent with 7 coils represents the 7 repositories along the southern route. The sword's length in proportion to the serpent's indicates the distance in Roman miles from the last known marker. And for those who understand the deeper mysteries, the serpent's spiral encodes the sequence in which the sites must be visited to unlock their guardians. This mention of guardians and sequences suggests the repositories weren't simply hidden, they were protected by security measures requiring specific knowledge to access safely. Hughes describes elaborate systems the Council of 13 designed to protect their caches. Some repositories required solving puzzles based on astronomical knowledge, visiting at specific times when celestial alignments created shadows or light effects that revealed hidden entrances. Others demanded understanding of acoustic principles, speaking specific tones or musical sequences that would trigger mechanical locks through resonance effects. One particularly sophisticated protection involved what Hughes calls bloodline recognition. Certain sites, he claims, were designed to respond only to individuals carrying the genetic markers of the ancient bloodline. These sites incorporated what sounds like biometric security, stones that would shift or doors that would unlock only when touched by someone with the proper genetic signature. While this might sound like fantasy, Hughes insists it was technology preserved from the ancient civilization, methods of detecting specific biological characteristics which medieval understanding interpreted as magic, but which were actually highly advanced science. The journal contains detailed instructions for bypassing or working with these security systems, though always presented in veiled language. He describes a site where stone drinks blood to reveal truth, apparently referring to a mechanism requiring a blood sample, perhaps to verify genetic markers. He mentions another location where the spiral song opens the way, seemingly indicating an acoustic lock requiring specific sound frequencies to activate. But perhaps the most significant encoding in this section involves what Hughes calls the Great Map of Connections. Over 4 pages, he has drawn what appears to be a stylized map of medieval Europe and the Mediterranean, but with unusual features. Cities and landmarks are represented not by their actual geographical positions, but by their relationships to what he calls the current, apparently referring to the network of ley lines or earth energies that the ancient civilization had mapped and utilized.
On this map, Jerusalem isn't in the Middle East, but at the center of a geometric pattern. Other Templar sites radiate outward in arrangements that follow mathematical relationships rather than physical geography. Hughes explains, "This map shows not where places are, but what they are. Position matters less than connection. The fortress drawn near the mountain is not near it in walking distance, but near it in the current's flow. To find the hidden path, one must think not as the crow flies, but as the current flows." This concept of navigation by energy rather than distance suggests the Templars understood something about the Earth's structure that conventional medieval geography didn't recognize. They were mapping not just physical locations, but points of power, nodes in a network of terrestrial energy that could be sensed by those with awakened perception. Hughes claims that traveling between Templar sites following these energy currents rather than straight-line routes allowed for something he calls resonant travel, movement that was somehow easier, faster, or safer than conventional journeys, as if the Earth itself facilitated passage along these preferred paths. The journal includes what Hughes calls the star mirror, a diagram showing the night sky with constellations marked and connected in patterns that don't match conventional astronomy. He explains that this celestial map mirrors the terrestrial one. As above, so below. The pattern of stars reflects the pattern of sacred sites. Where 3 stars of the Hunter's Belt align, so too align 3 repositories holding connected knowledge. The distance between celestial markers, when translated through the sacred ratio, reveals the distance between earthly caches. This celestial encoding explains why so many Templar structures incorporated specific astronomical alignments. Windows positioned to admit light at solstices or equinoxes. Pillars aligned with particular star rises. Geometric proportions reflecting celestial mechanics. These weren't just symbolic religious gestures, they were functional elements of a coded navigation and information system, allowing initiates to use astronomy to locate hidden sites and verify they had found the correct locations. Hughes also documents a linguistic encoding system based on what he calls the language of birds, an obscure medieval reference to a supposed secret language of initiates. He explains this wasn't literally about birds, but about using seemingly innocent words and phrases that carried hidden meanings to those trained to recognize them. Certain words appearing in Templar correspondence or carved into their buildings, when identified and their letters rearranged according to specific rules, revealed coordinates or instructions.
For example, he shows how the Latin phrase in hoc signo vinces, in this sign you shall conquer, commonly associated with Constantine and Christian symbolism, could be decoded differently. Take the third letter of each word, reverse their order, and apply the numeric values according to ancient Greek. The resulting sum gives the number of paces from the chapel door to the stone that moves. This section reveals why Templar structures are covered with seemingly random inscriptions, decorative elements, and symbolic carvings. Very little was actually random. Nearly every element served a function in the encoding system. Markers directing initiates to hidden knowledge, keys for unlocking coded messages, or components in larger puzzles that spanned multiple sites. Hughes includes specific case studies of hidden repositories and how to locate them. One example describes a cache supposedly hidden in southern France. Where the 5 roads meet at the foot of the sacred mountain, seek the chapel dedicated to the Magdalene. Enter at dawn on the feast of John the Baptist. Stand at the altar and observe where light strikes stone through the eastern window. Mark this spot. At dusk, return and mark where shadows from the western window fall. Where morning light and evening shadow intersect, there press the stone carved with the rose. It will yield to one who carries the blood. This instruction combines multiple encoding layers: symbolic timing, feast days with esoteric significance, astronomical observation, tracking light and shadow, geometric calculation, finding intersections, and biometric verification, the blood reference, suggesting genetic recognition. Even someone with the journal would need considerable knowledge and skill to successfully locate and access what it describes. But Hughes also includes warnings throughout this section. Not all the coded locations lead to repositories. Some are decoys designed to mislead or trap those seeking Templar treasures for the wrong reasons. He describes sites where the greedy will find only stone and darkness, suggesting that repositories included testing mechanisms that would deny access to those motivated by material gain rather than genuine seeking of knowledge. More ominously, he warns of sites deliberately compromised. 3 of the 13 primary caches have been given to the enemy. We allowed their discovery, filled them with half-truths and false paths that will lead astray those who follow them. Even should this journal fall into wrong hands, these poisoned wells will corrupt their understanding while protecting what truly matters. This admission that some information in the journal is deliberately false adds another layer of complexity. How would someone distinguish genuine directions from planted disinformation? Hughes suggests the answer lies in the awakening process itself, that those who have undergone genetic activation will instinctively recognize truth from deception through means beyond rational analysis. The 4th section concludes with Hughes' most explicit instructions for finding what he calls the primary repository, the location where the Codex Sanguinis was actually hidden after evacuation from Jerusalem. But even here, he maintains layers of encoding. Beyond the northern sea, where land meets water in perpetual twilight, there stands a chapel of ancient stone, newer than the ground it rests upon. 7 by 7 by 7 are its measures, and its dedication honors she who was first witness. Within its depths, where stone meets older stone, the light awaits those whose eyes have been opened, but know that it will not yield to force or greed, only to recognition. The blood knows its own. This cryptic description has driven treasure hunters to various locations, some identifying it with Roslin Chapel in Scotland, others proposing sites in Scandinavia or Ireland. The deliberate ambiguity ensured that even with the journal, finding the greatest treasure would require either profound scholarship, genetic awakening allowing intuitive recognition of the correct location, or both. And that, Hughes makes clear, was precisely the point. The knowledge wasn't meant for anyone determined enough to follow a map. It was meant specifically for those ready to receive it, those whose consciousness had evolved enough to use ancient wisdom wisely rather than exploiting it for power. The encoding wasn't just a security measure, it was a selection mechanism, ensuring that only the appropriate inheritors would successfully navigate the labyrinth of symbols, geometry, and hidden meanings to claim what the Templars had preserved.
The fifth section of Hugues de Montbard's journal takes a darker turn, shifting from documentation of knowledge and treasure to prophetic warnings about the approaching destruction of the Templar Order. What makes this section particularly compelling and controversial is that Hugues appears to be writing about events that haven't yet occurred, predicting with disturbing accuracy the persecution that would indeed come in 1307, years after he claims to be writing. Skeptics point to this section as proof the journal is a later forgery, arguing that no one could have predicted the Templars' downfall in such specific detail. But supporters counter that Hugues' access to the Codex Sanguinis and the awakened consciousness it provided could have given him genuine precognitive abilities, or at minimum, the capacity to read patterns in current events that allowed accurate prediction of inevitable outcomes. Hugues himself addresses this question directly. What appears as prophecy to those who cannot see is merely pattern recognition to those whose sight has been cleared. The future is not fixed, but probable, and the currents of power flowing through church and court show clearly where they must inevitably lead. The section begins with Hugues describing a council meeting in 1305, 2 years before the actual persecution began. The 13 members have gathered in an underground chamber, not beneath the Temple Mount. Jerusalem had fallen to Muslim forces decades earlier, but in a location he describes only as the Western Sanctuary. The mood is grim. Reports from their network of informants paint an alarming picture. King Philip IV of France is drowning in debt, much of it owed to Templar banking operations. The new Pope, Clement V, is weak and politically compromised, effectively a puppet of the French crown. And most disturbingly, the number of mysterious deaths among Templars who show signs of bloodline awakening has increased dramatically. "We are being culled," Hugues writes, describing the council's analysis of recent events. "The controller faction has decided we are become too dangerous to tolerate further. They have positioned their agents in positions of power, in Philip's court, in the papal curia, even within our own order. We are being observed, our activities catalogued, evidence compiled for the accusation that will justify our destruction." The council debates their options. Some advocate for military resistance. The Templars still command significant forces and could potentially defend their fortifications against royal armies. Others propose negotiation, offering to share some of their wealth or knowledge in exchange for protection. But Hugues and the majority recognize that neither approach addresses the fundamental problem. The knowledge they possess represents an existential threat to the established order, and no amount of force or negotiation will change that fact. Instead, the council votes to implement what Hugues calls the Great Concealment, the strategy we've encountered in previous sections. They will allow the visible Templar Order to be destroyed while ensuring the essential knowledge survives through hidden channels. But implementing this strategy requires something extraordinary. They must predict not just that persecution will come, but exactly how it will unfold so they can prepare appropriate responses. This is where Hugues' account becomes either remarkably prescient or evidence of later fabrication. He describes the council using techniques learned from the Codex Sanguinis to enter collective meditative states that allow what he calls probability projection, a form of consciousness that can perceive likely future timelines based on current trajectory. What they perceive during these sessions matches with eerie accuracy what actually occurred 2 years later. Hugues documents their visions. "We saw the dawn raids, simultaneous arrests across France on a single day. We saw knights taken in their sleep, given no chance to resist or flee. We saw accusations of heresy,
Descriptions of our secret rituals twisted into evidence of devil worship. We saw torture, false confessions extracted through unbearable pain. We saw executions, the greatest knights of Christendom burned as heretics while crowds cheered their destruction. But they also saw something the persecutors didn't anticipate: the survival and transformation of Templar knowledge through networks that would remain invisible precisely because the visible order's destruction would convince enemies that victory was complete. Hughes writes, "They will believe they have won, that the Templars and their dangerous knowledge have been eliminated from history. This belief will be our greatest protection, for they will stop hunting what they think is already destroyed." Based on these visions, the Council develops a detailed timeline for the evacuation and concealment operations. They predict the arrests will occur in October 1307, giving them approximately 2 years to prepare. They begin immediately, implementing the distribution strategy described in earlier sections, moving artifacts to hidden repositories, establishing false identities for key members, creating decoy sites to mislead pursuers, and positioning resources to support survivors after the persecution. But Hughes also documents something more psychologically complex: the Council's decision about who will be sacrificed. Not all Templars can be saved. The majority of the Order's members know nothing of the inner mysteries. They're simply devout knights serving what they believe is a Christian military order. Saving all of them would be impossible and would draw attention to the evacuation of those who matter most, the awakened bloodline carriers who possess the knowledge that can transform humanity's future. The journal reveals the cold calculation this requires. We must allow most to be captured. Their genuine ignorance of our deeper purposes will lend authenticity to the persecution. They will suffer and die believing themselves innocent of the charges, and their honest denials will paradoxically support the appearance of guilt, for prosecutors will assume their protestations are lies. Their sacrifice will be the price of preserving what matters most, not individual lives, but the knowledge that can transform humanity's future. This admission is perhaps the most morally troubling aspect of the journal. Hughes and the Inner Circle are essentially condemning hundreds of their brother knights to torture and execution to provide cover for a hidden remnant's escape. He struggles with this throughout the section. "Each night I am tormented by visions of men I have fought beside, men whose hands I have clasped in brotherhood, burning at stakes for crimes they did not commit, while I walk free with knowledge I could have shared to save them. But individual mercy would guarantee collective failure. We sacrifice hundreds to save knowledge that may eventually save millions. Does this calculation justify our choice? I cannot say. I can only accept the burden of having made it."
The section includes detailed instructions for Templars selected for survival. They're given new identities months or years before the persecution, gradually transitioning into civilian roles as merchants, craftsmen, minor clergy. They're taught to display skepticism or even hostility toward the Templar Order publicly, establishing reputations as critics or former members who left disillusioned. They're positioned in locations far from major Templar centers, making it less likely they'll be caught in the initial sweep of arrests. Most critically, they're taught what Hughes calls memory compartmentalization, techniques for psychologically separating knowledge into isolated sections so that even under torture, they cannot reveal what they don't consciously access. This practice, drawn from methods preserved in the Codex, allows parts of the mind to be sealed off, accessible only through specific triggers that interrogators wouldn't discover. A captured Templar using these techniques might genuinely not remember certain information while being questioned, only recovering it later if they escaped or were released. Hughes also documents the creation of what he terms confession scripts, predetermined stories that captured Templars could offer under torture that would seem incriminating enough to satisfy interrogators while revealing nothing of actual importance. These scripts explained the controversial rituals, but attributed them to corruption or demonic influence rather than preserved ancient knowledge. They acknowledged secret ceremonies, but described them as heretical practices rather than awakening procedures. They provided scapegoats, named individuals already dead or safely beyond capture as leaders of supposed corruption. We give them a story they can believe, Hughes explains, one that confirms their assumptions about heresy and devil worship, while concealing the actual truth about genetic activation and preserved ancient science. They want to believe we commune with demons, so we let them believe it. The truth that we commune with our own dormant potential is far more dangerous to their worldview than any demon could be. The section contains extensive documentation of the evacuation itself. Hughes describes the careful choreography required to move massive amounts of material, documents, artifacts, precious metals, from Templar properties to hidden locations without attracting attention. Some items are smuggled out in plain sight, disguised as ordinary trade goods. Others are moved through underground passages connecting Templar properties to locations beyond official boundaries. The most precious items, including the Codex Sanguinis, are entrusted to small groups who will travel to remote locations far from centers of church and royal power. The Templar fleet plays a crucial role in these plans. Hughes writes of ships loaded with treasures departing from La Rochelle in the weeks before the arrests, bound for destinations that remain deliberately vague in his account: the northern islands, the western lands, ports beyond the Pope's reach. Whether these references indicate Scotland, Scandinavia, or even more distant locations remains a subject of speculation, but Hughes makes clear that maritime escape routes were essential to the survival strategy. He also documents the psychological preparation required for those who would remain and face arrest. They're given techniques for enduring torture, mental frameworks for maintaining purpose despite suffering, and spiritual practices for accepting death without breaking their vows of secrecy. Hughes includes meditation instructions, breathing exercises, and what he calls consciousness separation methods that allow the mind to distance itself from physical pain. Pain is inevitable, he writes, but suffering is a relationship between consciousness and pain. By altering that relationship, by observing pain as a phenomenon occurring to the body rather than to the essential self, the initiated can endure what would break ordinary men. This is not supernatural power, but natural human capability, dormant in most, but accessible through training. Our brothers who face the Inquisitors will need this skill, for the torture will be severe and prolonged. The section includes Hughes' personal preparations for the possibility of capture. He describes creating multiple layers of false identity, establishing documentation that would make him appear to be a minor knight of no particular importance if arrested. He practices the compartmentalization techniques obsessively, ensuring that even under the worst torture, he cannot reveal the locations of the primary repositories or the identities of the most important survivors. He writes letters to be delivered after his death, continuing the work of encoding and concealment even beyond his own lifespan. Most poignantly, he writes about saying goodbye to brothers he knows he'll never see again. Today I embrace Geoffrey for what I know is the last time. He will be among those captured. His position is too public. His face is too well known to disappear successfully. He knows this, though we do not speak of it directly. We clasp hands, exchange words about mundane matters, and beneath it all flows the unspoken acknowledgement that we are participating in a tragedy of necessity. He will die screaming my name under torture, genuinely not knowing where I am, and I will live with that knowledge until my own death comes. The 5th section concludes with Hugues' reflection on the meaning of their sacrifice. We are not the first to face this choice, and we will not be the last. Throughout history, whenever humanity approaches the threshold of transformation, forces arise to suppress that evolution. The controllers fear change because change threatens their dominance. They fear knowledge because knowledge creates independence. They fear awakening because awakened humans cannot be controlled through the crude tools of threat and deception. Our order will be destroyed, our members killed or scattered, our name made synonymous with heresy and corruption. But the knowledge survives, the bloodline survives, the potential for human awakening survives. And centuries from now, when the time is right, new guardians will arise. They will find what we have hidden. They will decode what we have encrypted. They will continue the work we could not complete. This is the true meaning of the Templar legacy, not gold or treasure or earthly power, but the preservation of human potential across the dark centuries until humanity is ready to claim its birthright. We die so that knowledge might live. We are erased from history so that truth might survive in secret, waiting for the dawn. With these words, Hugues shifts from predicting the persecution to describing its aftermath, the subject of the journal's 6th section, where his account becomes a first-hand narrative of survival in the decades following 1307, written by a hunted man who knows his time is running out.
The 6th section of Hugues de Montbard's journal undergoes a dramatic shift in tone and format. The earlier sections were written with scholarly precision, organized and methodical despite their controversial content. But beginning with entries dated after October 1307, the handwriting becomes more erratic, the organization less structured, the emotional weight palpable on every page. This is no longer a man documenting history. This is a fugitive recording his survival, knowing that each entry might be his last. The section opens with a stark entry dated October 14, 1307. It has begun. Word reached me yesterday that Paris Temple was surrounded at dawn. Hundreds arrested, Choc de Molay and chains. Everything we predicted has come to pass. I write this from a safe house 20 leagues south, having fled the moment our warning system activated. I am alive. Most of my brothers are not. The guilt is crushing, but the mission must continue. Hugues describes the elaborate warning network the Council of 13 had established in the years preceding the persecution. A system of signal fires, courier routes, and coded messages designed to alert key members the moment arrests began. He had been at a commandery in southern France when the signal came, a simple message delivered by a rider who spoke a single phrase: "The harvest fails." Those 2 words activated a pre-planned escape sequence he'd rehearsed dozens of times, but never believed he'd actually need to execute. Within an hour of receiving the warning, Hugues had shed his Templar identity. The white mantle with its red cross was buried in a sealed container along with documents and personal items that connected him to the order. He adopted the identity of Mathieu the Scribe, a minor scholar traveling to monasteries to copy manuscripts, a cover identity he'd been building for 2 years, complete with letters of introduction, work samples, and a documented history that would withstand casual investigation. But establishing a false identity and actually living as a fugitive proved vastly different. The journal documents the psychological toll. I find myself flinching at shadows, seeing threats in every stranger's glance. Sleep comes rarely and poorly. I wake from nightmares where inquisitors have found me, where I'm burning at the stake while brothers I've abandoned watch from the crowd. During the day, I maintain the fiction of Mathieu the harmless scholar. At night, I am Hugues the traitor, alive because others died in my place. The entries over the following months become a chronicle of constant movement. Hugues travels through southern France, never staying more than a few days in any location. He survives by actually doing the manuscript copying work his cover identity claims he does.
accepting small payments from monasteries while secretly searching their libraries for texts that might be fragments of the ancient knowledge. He also begins checking the sites marked in the encoded maps from earlier sections, verifying that hidden repositories remain undiscovered and secure. But he's not alone in this work. The journal reveals that the survivor network, while scattered and operating with extreme caution, maintains contact through the communication systems they'd established. Messages are left in predetermined locations, hollows in specific trees, loose stones in bridge foundations, marks carved into church door frames that only the initiated would recognize as meaningful. Through these methods, Hugh receives updates about the persecution's progress and the survivors' status. The news is devastating. In Paris, Jacques de Molay and other senior leaders are being tortured brutally. Many have provided confessions, though Hugh notes with grim satisfaction that the confessions match the prepared scripts, incriminating enough to satisfy inquisitors, but revealing nothing of genuine importance. The torturers believe they're extracting truth, never suspecting they're being fed carefully crafted fiction designed to protect the real secrets. But not all captured Templars had the mental training to withstand interrogation. Some broke completely, providing genuine information about Templar sites and activities. Through his intelligence network, Hugh learns that several commanderies have been thoroughly searched, their hidden chambers discovered and looted. Some repositories marked in his maps have been compromised. He updates his journal accordingly, crossing out certain locations and adding warnings. The Burgundy cache is lost. Assume all documents there captured. The Barcelona site remains secure but is under surveillance. Approach only with extreme caution. The journal documents several close calls. In one incident, Hugh is working in a monastery library when royal investigators arrive asking about Templars who might be hiding in the region. He continues copying manuscripts calmly while they question the abbot, his false identity holding despite his racing heart. In another instance, he narrowly avoids recognition by a former Templar who has turned informant, fleeing through a market crowd moments before the man can alert nearby soldiers. Perhaps most harrowing is his account of witnessing an execution. In spring 1308, Hugh is in a town where captured Templars are being burned at the stake. He describes forcing himself to attend, maintaining his cover as a curious onlooker while watching men he'd known for decades die screaming. One of the condemned locks eyes with Hugh in the crowd for a brief moment. Recognition flickers, but the doomed knight says nothing, protecting Hugh's secret even as the flames consume him. I don't know if he kept silent out of brotherhood or simply because speech had become impossible, but I will carry his sacrifice to my own death.
One particularly detailed account describes Hughes spending 3 months in a monastery where he identifies a young monk showing clear signs of bloodline heritage, unusual dreams, spontaneous flashes of knowledge about things he's never studied, and intuitive understanding of symbolic systems. Hughes gradually befriends him, sharing increasingly esoteric teachings disguised as mystical Christianity. By the time Hughes departs, the young monk has been given encoded texts, taught consciousness techniques, and provided with enough information to eventually find a hidden repository, though he doesn't yet understand the full significance of what he's received. I am planting seeds, Hughes reflects, knowing I will never see them flower. These young inheritors may take decades to understand what I've given them. Some may never fully grasp it. But if even 1 in 10 successfully awakens and continues the work, the chain of transmission remains unbroken. The knowledge survives another generation. The journal also documents the survivor network's efforts to support each other. Through the coded communication system, scattered Templars share resources, warn of dangers, and coordinate activities. When one survivor is captured or killed, others move to secure what he'd been protecting. When royal investigators get too close to a repository, the network activates to evacuate or further conceal it. They function as a distributed organism, with no central leadership or fixed structure, making them nearly impossible for authorities to completely eliminate. But the toll of this hunted existence weighs on Hughes increasingly. Entries from 1310 and beyond show signs of physical and psychological deterioration. He describes chronic health problems, likely stress-related conditions exacerbated by poor nutrition and constant travel. He mentions increasing difficulty maintaining the mental disciplines that protect his memories from inadvertent revelation. Most troubling, he admits to moments of doubt about whether any of this is worthwhile. Some days I question everything. Perhaps we should have simply died with our brothers. Perhaps this skulking survival, this fearful preservation of secrets, is cowardice disguised as duty. But these dark moments alternate with renewed determination, often triggered by signs that the work is succeeding. He receives word through the network that repositories remain secure, that new carriers are being identified and awakened, that the knowledge is indeed surviving despite the persecution's brutality. In one entry from 1312, he writes, "Today, I met with a young inheritor I'd approached 3 years ago. He has progressed remarkably, accessing genetic memories and demonstrating capabilities that exceed what I achieved at twice his age. This gives me hope. The bloodline is strong. The awakening continues. Our sacrifice is not in vain." The section includes Hughes' observations about the controller faction's response to the persecution's outcome. Initially triumphant about destroying the visible Templar Order, they gradually realize that key figures have vanished and crucial knowledge remains beyond their grasp. The journal describes increased efforts to hunt surviving Templars, with agents searching across Europe using descriptions and identifying characteristics. But the survivors' preparations prove effective, their false identities hold, their concealment methods work, and the controller faction's agents repeatedly come up empty. They grow frustrated, Hughes notes with satisfaction. They destroyed the order, but failed to capture what matters most. The codex remains beyond their reach. The primary repositories are secure, and the survivors continue the work, invisible because they expected our destruction and prepared accordingly. Their victory is hollow, though they don't yet fully realize it. As years pass, Hughes's role shifts from active fugitive to elder statesman of the survivor network. Younger inheritors who've been awakened since the persecution look to him for guidance and verification of knowledge they're accessing through genetic memories. He becomes a living bridge between the pre-persecution Templars and the emerging new generation of guardians who will carry the work forward. But age and stress are taking their toll. Entries from 1315 and onward mention increasing health problems, moments of confusion, difficulty maintaining the rigorous mental disciplines that protect his memories from inadvertent revelation. He knows his time is limited and begins making preparations for his death. Most importantly, he makes the decision to compile and conceal this journal itself. The comprehensive account that, if found by appropriate inheritors, could provide crucial information for continuing the mission after he's gone. The 6th section concludes with a poignant entry from 1316. "I feel my strength failing. The years of flight, the constant vigilance, the weight of what I carry, all of it has worn me down. I have perhaps months left, maybe less. But the work is established, the network survives, the knowledge endures. My part in this ancient drama approaches its end, but the story continues with or without me. I have chosen the location where I will spend my final days, a remote monastery in the mountains where I can complete this journal and arrange for its concealment. The brothers here know me only as Mathieu, an elderly scholar seeking quiet for his final research. They do not know they harbor one of the last surviving members of the Council of 13, or that the documents I carefully hide among foundation stones contain truths that kingdoms have killed to suppress. When death comes, as it soon must, I will face it knowing that I kept faith with the mission. I protected the knowledge. I transmitted it to new guardians. I preserved what mattered most, even at terrible personal cost. Whether this was wisdom or folly, righteousness or sin, history will judge. I can only say that I did what I believed necessary, and I die believing the choice was right, even though the burden nearly crushed me. These are the last words of the 6th section, not yet Hughes's final entry, but close to it, written by a man who knows his time is almost done and is preparing to pass into history, leaving behind only this dangerous, precious record of truths that powerful forces wanted buried forever.
The 7th section of Hugues de Montbard's journal takes on an almost meditative quality, written in what he clearly knows are his final months. The entries are dated between March and August of 1316, composed at the remote monastery he references at the end of the previous section, a place he identifies only as the sanctuary of stones where earth meets sky. Scholars have speculated this might be the Abbey of Saint-Martin-du-Canigou in the French Pyrenees, though definitive identification remains impossible. The section opens with Hugues describing his arrival at this final refuge. I came to this mountain monastery 3 weeks ago, presenting myself as an aged scholar seeking peaceful isolation to complete a theological work before death claims me. The abbot, a kind man with tired eyes, asked no difficult questions. He assigned me a cell in the oldest part of the abbey, a stone chamber that dates to an era before this order claimed these mountains. The walls remember older purposes, older prayers. I feel them speaking in the silence between heartbeats. This reference to walls remembering older purposes isn't merely poetic. Hugues explains that he deliberately chose this monastery because his research indicated it was built atop a much older sacred site, possibly one of the locations marked on the ancient maps recovered from beneath Jerusalem. He describes exploring the monastery's deepest levels, finding architectural anomalies that suggest construction techniques far more sophisticated than 8th century Carolingian builders should have possessed. Massive foundation stones fitted together with impossible precision. Geometric proportions encoded into the structure's dimensions. Alignment with celestial phenomena that serve no apparent Christian liturgical purpose. This place was a temple long before it was a monastery, Hugues writes. The monks who pray here daily have no idea they walk above chambers that predate their religion by millennia. But I can feel them, spaces beneath spaces, knowledge beneath knowledge, waiting in darkness for those prepared to receive it. This is fitting. I will complete my testimony above an undiscovered repository of the very truths I document. The guardian will rest above what he guards, even in death. But Hugues hasn't come simply to die in symbolic surroundings. His final months are intensely productive. He describes working systematically through his memories, committing to writing everything he can recall about Templar discoveries, rituals, repositories, and the Survivor Network's organization. He works primarily at night when the monastery sleeps, his candle the only light in the ancient stone corridors, his quill scratching out page after page of encoded testimony. The process is both physically and emotionally exhausting. His hands cramp from hours of writing. His eyes strain in the flickering candlelight. But more difficult is the psychological burden of reliving everything he's witnessed, the knowledge gained, the brothers lost, the moral compromises made in service of preservation. Some nights I write until tears blind me, he admits. Mourning again men who died decades ago, questioning again choices that cannot be unmade. The past returns with such vividness that I am simultaneously a young knight first touching the codex in wonder, and an old man dying alone on a mountain, connected across the years by memory that refuses to release me.
Hugh also describes experiencing what he believes are genetic memories from previous guardians of the knowledge, individuals who lived and died protecting similar truths in earlier ages. He writes of dreaming himself into the consciousness of a priest in ancient Egypt, watching from shadows as sacred texts are hidden before an invading army arrives, of inhabiting the awareness of a Greek philosopher secreting manuscripts before fleeing Roman persecution, of living briefly as a warrior scholar during the collapse of an even older civilization, desperately preserving knowledge as his entire world crumbles around him. "I am not the first," he reflects, "merely the latest in a chain stretching back to the beginning of human memory. Each link does what it can to preserve and transmit, then passes into darkness, trusting that the next link will hold. This is the nature of the work, an endless relay race where the baton is knowledge itself, passed from dying hand to living hand across generations, cultures, civilizations. I run my portion of this eternal race, feeling my strength fail as I search desperately for someone to receive what I carry." The journal documents several incidents where young monks approach Hugh, drawn by something they can't articulate. He observes them carefully, looking for signs of bloodline heritage. One novice named Brother Anselm shows particular promise: spontaneous understanding of complex symbolic systems, dreams of places and events he's never experienced, an almost painful sensitivity to the monastery's older energies that others seem oblivious to. Hugh begins subtly educating Anselm, weaving esoteric teachings into conversations about conventional theology. He teaches meditation techniques disguised as prayer practices. He discusses geometric and astronomical principles under the pretext of understanding God's mathematical perfection in creation. And gradually he observes signs of awakening, moments when Anselm's eyes widen with recognition of truths he shouldn't consciously know, instances where he speaks words in languages he's never studied, flashes of abilities that exceed normal human perception. "He is ready," he writes, "or nearly so, young enough to continue the work for decades after I am gone, capable enough to find and access the repositories if properly prepared. I will give him everything I can in the time remaining, encoded in ways that will unfold as his awakening progresses. He will not understand it all immediately. Understanding will come in stages as he grows into his heritage. But the seed will be planted. Another link in the chain will be forged." The journal includes detailed descriptions of Hugh's final preparations for death. He writes letters to be discovered by Anselm and others after his passing, letters that appear to be conventional religious meditations but contain encoded instructions for finding this journal and accessing repositories. He creates multiple layers of concealment for the journal itself, hiding it among the monastery's foundation stones in a location that will require specific knowledge to discover, ensuring only appropriate inheritors will retrieve it. He also describes undergoing what he calls consciousness preparation, practices designed to maintain awareness through the dying process and potentially beyond. Drawing on techniques preserved in the Codex, he attempts to program his consciousness with the intention to guide future guardians even after physical death.
Whether this is achievable or merely the hope of a dying man desperate to continue serving the mission, Hughes himself isn't certain. Perhaps consciousness survives death and can influence the living. Perhaps this is merely comforting delusion. But I practice the techniques faithfully. If there is even a possibility that I can guide from beyond, I must try. The work is too important to abandon simply because my body fails. Entries from June 1316 show increasing physical decline. Hughes mentions constant pain, difficulty maintaining lucidity, periods where past and present blur together. But between these confusions come moments of remarkable clarity, where insights flood through him with intensity that takes his breath away. He describes one such experience. Today, while meditating in my cell, I felt myself expand beyond the boundaries of this failing flesh. For a timeless moment, I was simultaneously myself and not myself, connected to a vast consciousness that spans all awakened individuals across time. I felt the presence of those who came before, those who will come after, all linked in a network of awareness that transcends individual existence. The mission isn't carried by isolated individuals. We are nodes in a living web of consciousness, each contributing our thread to a pattern whose full design only becomes visible from outside time. This mystical experience seems to give Hughes peace about his approaching death. Subsequent entries show less anxiety, more acceptance, even gratitude for the life he's lived despite its hardships. I have seen wonders that most humans never imagine exist. I have touched artifacts from civilizations so ancient they predate legend. I have accessed genetic memories that allow me to experience lives lived thousands of years before my birth. I have been part of a brotherhood dedicated to humanity's highest potential. Yes, I have also suffered exile, fear, guilt, loss. But would I trade the suffering to avoid the wonder? No, 1,000 times no. Better to live one lifetime truly awake than 10 lifetimes comfortable in delusion. The journal also includes Hughes's reflections on what he believes the future holds for the preserved knowledge. He writes of sensing that humanity approaches a crucial transition point, not in his lifetime, but in centuries to come when the knowledge can finally be revealed without triggering the same violent suppression that destroyed the visible Templar Order. The time will come when human consciousness has evolved enough to receive these truths without fear, when science advances to the point where ancient technologies become comprehensible rather than miraculous, when social structures mature beyond the hierarchies that require ignorance to maintain control. In that future age, repositories will be discovered, encoded texts will be deciphered, and humanity will reclaim heritage it never knew existed. I will not live to see this flowering. None of my generation will. But we plant seeds knowing that others will harvest. We protect knowledge for inheritors not yet born. We maintain the chain of transmission, trusting that eventually, inevitably, the light will emerge from darkness. This is the faith that sustains me. Not faith in God's intervention or divine plan, but faith in human potential, in the unstoppable impulse towards awakening that cannot be permanently suppressed no matter how brutally opposed. In late July, Hughes writes what he believes will be his final teaching session with Brother Anselm. He gives the young monk a small book of seemingly conventional prayers and meditations, but encoded within the text are coordinates for several repositories, instructions for consciousness techniques, and hints about the journal's location. Anselm accepts the gift with gratitude, not yet understanding its full significance. Hughes watches him leave, knowing he's done everything possible to establish continuity. He will understand eventually. The awakening will progress. He will find what I've hidden. The chain continues. My part is complete. The last dated entry is August 12, 1316. Hughes describes increasing weakness, difficulty breathing, pain that even consciousness techniques can barely manage. But rather than fear or despair, his words convey something approaching joy. I feel my awareness beginning to separate from physical form. Dying isn't the ending I feared in youth, merely a transition, a changing of state. The knowledge I carry doesn't disappear. It returns to the vast reservoir from which all consciousness emerges. Perhaps some trace of individual identity survives. Perhaps not. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the work continues, the light is preserved, the mission endures. To whoever finds this journal, you are meant to find it. Your hands hold these pages because the chain of transmission has brought you to this moment. Do not fear what you read here. Do not dismiss it as madness or fantasy. Test the information. Follow the maps. Access the repositories. Undergo the awakening, then decide whether to continue the work or let it end with you. But know this, you are not alone. You have never been alone. Behind you stretches a line of guardians extending back to humanity's beginning. Before you lies a line extending towards humanity's ultimate becoming. You stand between past and future, holding in your hands the link that connects them. What you do with this responsibility will ripple through time in ways you cannot foresee. I, Brother Hughes de Montbar, last survivor of the Council of 13, final guardian of the Templar mysteries, write these words as my body fails and my consciousness prepares for transition. I have kept faith with the mission. I have preserved what was entrusted to me. I pass the burden and the honor to you, unknown inheritor. May you have the wisdom to use this knowledge well. May you have the courage to protect it as fiercely as we did. May you have the vision to recognize when humanity is ready to receive it. The light waits in darkness. The seeds sleep in stone. The ancient knowledge rests in hidden chambers, guarded by time and encoded in symbols, waiting for those prepared to claim it. Find it. Understand it. Use it to awaken yourself and others to the truth of human potential. My watch ends. Yours begins. The chain remains unbroken. These are Hughes de Montbar's final written words, at least the final words that survive in the journal discovered in 1894. Whether he lived days or weeks beyond this entry remains unknown. Whether Brother Anselm found and understood the clues left for him is unrecorded. Whether the consciousness techniques Hughes practiced allowed some trace of awareness to persist beyond physical death cannot be verified. What remains is the journal itself, testimony to a life lived in service of truths that powerful forces wanted destroyed, documentation of knowledge that could transform human understanding of history and potential, and a final message to unknown inheritors who might centuries later prove ready to receive what the Templars died protecting.
The eighth and final section of this investigation shifts from Hugh de Montbard's own words to the aftermath of his journal's discovery, the century-long struggle over its authenticity, the mysterious deaths and disappearances surrounding it, and the troubling question of whether the knowledge it describes might actually exist, hidden in locations across Europe, waiting to be found by those who can decode its secrets. When Jean-Baptiste Mercier discovered the leather-bound journal in that abandoned monastery in 1894, he had no idea he was pulling a thread that would unravel across decades, touching lives and ending some, attracting obsessive scholars and ruthless collectors, and ultimately disappearing into the very secrecy it documented. The journal's journey after discovery is almost as mysterious as its contents. Father Dominic, the village priest who first examined the journal and made those crucial copies before Vatican agents arrived, died in a fire that investigators called suspicious. His house burned with unusual intensity. Witnesses reported flames that seemed to burn hotter and brighter than normal wood fires should produce. The official cause was listed as an overturned lamp, but neighbors testified that Father Dominic was meticulous about fire safety, making such an accident highly unlikely. His nephew, who smuggled the copied pages to Paris, claimed in a letter written years later that he'd been followed for months after his uncle's death by men who asked no questions but watched from shadows, as if waiting to see if he possessed something they wanted to recover. The copied pages that reached Paris created immediate controversy in academic circles. Some scholars declared them obvious forgeries. Medieval-style parchment and ink could be replicated by skilled craftsmen, and the content was too fantastical to be genuine historical testimony. But others noted details that seemed impossible to fake. The consistency of the handwriting across hundreds of pages showing natural variation that a forger would struggle to maintain. The use of obscure medieval Latin terminology and grammatical constructions that were only documented in highly specialized texts. And most remarkably, descriptions of locations and artifacts
that matched archaeological discoveries made after 1894. This last point became particularly compelling as the 20th century progressed. Hugues' journal described specific chambers beneath the Temple Mount that official histories claimed didn't exist. Yet when British engineers conducted surveys in the 1860s-1870s, and later archaeological teams gained limited access to the site, they found tunnels and chambers matching Hugues' descriptions with disturbing accuracy. How could a 19th century forger know details about spaces that hadn't been officially documented until decades after the journal's discovery? Similarly, Hugues' descriptions of Templar sites across Europe contained architectural details and hidden features that researchers only verified through careful investigation. A monastery in southern France, mentioned in the journal, was examined in the 1920s. Investigators found precisely the geometric anomalies and foundation irregularities Hugues had described. A ruined chapel in Scotland, referenced in the encoded sections, revealed, upon careful measurement, dimensional ratios matching those Hugues claimed were markers of Templar sacred geometry. It was as if the journal was being validated by archaeology piece by piece, evidence accumulating that its author had either genuine first-hand knowledge or access to information unavailable to 19th century scholars. But verification attempts came at a cost. In 1909, a French historian named Dr. Marcel Fontaine published a preliminary analysis of the journal's astronomical references, demonstrating that the celestial alignments Hugues described for various Templar sites were mathematically accurate for the 14th century. 3 weeks after publication, Dr. Fontaine disappeared while researching in the archives of a monastery in the Languedoc region. His body was never found. His notes vanished from his office. Colleagues who asked too many questions about his disappearance received anonymous warnings to leave buried things buried. The pattern repeated throughout the early 20th century. Scholars who investigated the journal too deeply experienced professional destruction, denied tenure, excluded from conferences, their research funding mysteriously withdrawn. Some received direct threats. Others suffered accidents, falls, poisonings, violent robberies that seemed too coincidental to be random. The message was clear. Someone wanted the journal discredited, forgotten, or at minimum, not seriously investigated. The Vatican's role in this suppression remained officially murky but functionally obvious. While church officials never publicly acknowledged the journal's existence, private correspondence between bishops and cardinals, some of which leaked decades later, revealed deep concern about what they termed the Montbard document. One leaked letter from a Vatican archivist to a cardinal, dated 1912, stated bluntly, "The journal contains allegations about church history that, if widely believed, would undermine several foundational doctrines. Whether authentic or fabricated, its circulation serves no purpose but confusion and doubt. All means of suppression are justified." World War II provided cover for even more aggressive action against the journal and those who studied it. During the Nazi occupation of France, several collections containing journal materials were systematically raided. The Gestapo, working with lists that some witnesses claimed came from Vatican sources, confiscated manuscripts, arrested collectors, and in at least 2 documented cases, executed individuals whose only crime was possessing copies of Hugues' writings. After the war, these confiscated materials never reappeared, vanished into the chaos of the occupation, or, more likely, deliberately destroyed or hidden by forces that wanted the knowledge suppressed. Yet the journal refused to die completely. Like the Templar legacy it described, it survived through copies, fragments, and encoded transmissions. Portions were photographed before confiscation. Scholars made handwritten transcripts. Some sections were even encoded into academic papers on other subjects. Information hidden in plain sight through the same techniques Hugues described the Templars using. By the 1960s, a complete text of the journal existed in distributed form across dozens of sources, none of which individually contained enough to be dangerous, but which collectively preserved the entire document. The modern era brought new dimensions to the mystery. When computer analysis became available in the 1990s, researchers subjected the journal's encoded sections to sophisticated decryption algorithms. The results were startling. The
The geometric diagrams, when processed as mathematical data, yielded GPS coordinates, a navigation system that wouldn't exist until centuries after Hughes's death. When these coordinates were investigated, several pointed to locations where archaeological anomalies or unexplained structures indeed existed. Coincidence? Or evidence that Hughes was encoding information using principles that transcended his historical period's limitations? Most intriguing were coordinates that pointed to remote, rarely visited locations, mountain caves, abandoned quarries, areas of ocean floor. Some of these have been investigated by treasure hunters and researchers, though what they found remains largely unreported. Rumors circulate in collector communities of artifacts recovered that match Hughes' descriptions, immediately confiscated by government agencies or purchased by anonymous buyers who pay extraordinary sums for absolute discretion. Whether these rumors reflect genuine discoveries or are merely the fevered speculation of conspiracy theorists remains unclear. What is documented is the continued interest of powerful institutions in suppressing or controlling information about the journal. In 2003, a Spanish academic who announced plans to publish a comprehensive analysis of the journal's geographic references died in a car accident 2 weeks before the manuscript was due to the publisher. The manuscript disappeared from his office before his family could retrieve it.
In 2011, a documentary filmmaker investigating Templar sites mentioned in the journal experienced systematic harassment. Camera equipment stolen, interview subjects suddenly refusing to participate, funding sources withdrawing support. The documentary was never completed. Yet simultaneously, there's been a subtle shift in how established institutions discuss Templar history. Academic conferences that once dismissed Templar mysticism as pure legend now cautiously acknowledge that the order may have possessed unusual knowledge, though they attribute it to extensive contact with Islamic and Jewish scholarship rather than the ancient repositories Hughes describes. Archaeological investigations beneath the Temple Mount, when politics allows, proceed with a curious selectivity as if researchers know what they're looking for even if they can't publicly admit it. And certain European museums have quietly acquired artifacts of unknown provenance that exhibit the sophisticated metallurgy and impossible precision Hughes claims characterized ancient hybrid civilization technologies. The question that haunts everyone who seriously engages with the journal is the same question that haunted Hughes himself. What do we do if it's true? If repositories of ancient knowledge really exist, hidden across Europe and beyond, containing technologies and consciousness techniques that could transform human civilization, should they be revealed? Are we, as a species, ready for truths that might shatter comfortable certainties about our history, our capabilities, our place in the cosmos? Hughes believed his era wasn't ready, that the knowledge needed to remain hidden until human consciousness evolved to handle it responsibly, but he also believed that time would eventually come. The journal itself is structured as a message in a bottle cast forward through centuries to reach inheritors who would recognize its value and have the wisdom to use it appropriately. Some readers of these pages might dismiss the journal as an elaborate hoax, a 19th century forgery, or even a 14th century fabrication created for unknown purposes but certainly not genuine historical testimony of forbidden Templar knowledge. This interpretation allows comfortable certainty. We can file the journal alongside other historical curiosities and move on with our lives unchanged. But others, who have studied the journal deeply, who have followed its encoded instructions, who have found artifacts and locations it specifies, who have practiced the consciousness techniques it describes, and experienced results they cannot explain through conventional understanding, these individuals know something that makes comfortable certainty impossible. They know that whether every detail is historically accurate or not, the journal describes something real. Knowledge exists. Techniques work. Repositories wait, undiscovered or deliberately concealed, holding information that challenges fundamental assumptions about human history and potential. And they know that pursuing this knowledge comes with genuine risk. The same forces that destroyed the visible Templar Order in 1307, that suppressed the journal after 1894, that eliminated researchers who investigated too deeply, these forces still operate. Different names, different institutional structures, but the same fundamental agenda, controlling what humanity knows about its origins and potential. They fear awakening because awakened humans cannot be easily controlled. They fear ancient knowledge because it challenges the monopolies of power built on controlled ignorance. So the journal remains in twilight status, not completely suppressed, but not widely known, available to those who seek it but obscured from casual discovery. Fragments circulate online, often dismissed as creative fiction or conspiracy fantasy. Physical copies exist in private collections, protected by owners who understand the danger of public disclosure. The knowledge it contains exists in encoded form, accessible to those who have the key, but invisible to those who lack the perspective to recognize what they're seeing. Perhaps that's exactly as Hughes intended. Perhaps the journal's current status, simultaneously hidden and discoverable, dismissed by mainstream scholars but intensely studied by a hidden community of inheritors, precisely mirrors the strategy he described the Templars using, preserving knowledge in plain sight through layers of concealment that keep it safe from those who would misuse it while remaining accessible to those ready to receive it.
The final question, then, is directed at you, reading these words now. Do you dismiss the journal as historical curiosity? Interesting, perhaps, but ultimately fiction or delusion? Or do you recognize in Hughes's testimony something that resonates at a level deeper than rational analysis, something that calls to inherited memories you didn't know you carried, something that makes you understand that you're not reading about the past, but about a mission that continues in the present? If the latter, then you face the same choice every Templar Guardian has faced across centuries. Do you pursue this knowledge despite the risks? Do you follow the maps, decode the symbols, access the repositories? Do you undergo the awakening that might transform your understanding of reality itself? Or do you choose safety, comfort, the known world with its familiar limitations? The journal waits. The repositories endure. The ancient knowledge rests in darkness, protected by time and encoded in symbols that reveal themselves only to those prepared to see. The chain of transmission reaches forward from Hughes de Montbard's dying hand, seeking the living hand that will grasp it and carry the burden and the honor forward another generation. Perhaps that hand is yours. Perhaps you are reading these words because the same forces that guided Hughes to discovery, that selected the founding Templars, that have preserved this knowledge across millennia, perhaps those forces have guided you here, to this moment, to this choice. The light waits in darkness. The truth rests beneath comfortable lies. The potential for human transformation endures despite centuries of suppression. And the question Hughes asked in his final words echoes still. Are you prepared to claim the heritage that was hidden to protect it? The knowledge that was buried so it might one day be found? The truth that was encoded in symbols across centuries so that when humanity was ready, it would finally be decoded and understood? The Templars are gone, but their legacy remains. The journal is written. The maps are drawn. The repositories wait. The ancient knowledge endures. And somewhere, always, inheritors arise who hear the call, who recognize the symbols, who feel the genetic memories stirring in their consciousness, telling them that they are part of something far older and far greater than their individual lives, a mission that spans the entire arc of human history, from our mysterious origins to our undetermined destiny. The watch that Hughes ended passes to new guardians. The chain remains unbroken. The light prepares to emerge from darkness. Not today, perhaps, not yet, but inevitably. When the time is right, when consciousness has evolved enough, when humanity is ready to remember what it has spent centuries trying to forget. Are you ready? The journal gives you the tools. The maps show the way. The techniques await your practice. The knowledge is preserved. The choice is yours. The Lost Templar Journal has been found. The forbidden notes have been read. The question is no longer whether the knowledge exists, but what you will do now that you know it does. The dawn approaches. The age of awakening begins. And you, holding these words in your awareness, stand at the threshold of transformation, exactly where Hughes de Montbard stood 7 centuries ago, when he first touched the Codex Sanguinis and felt the ancient knowledge flood through his consciousness, changing everything. The rest of the story isn't written yet, because the rest of the story is yours to write.